Is there any evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible? The writer Lee Strobel once said, if the Jesus of faith is not also the Jesus of history, he's powerless and meaningless. And so in this video, we're going to blitz through just 8 writers who spoke about Jesus in the first 150 years from his death. Now, there are many more than 8 writers. I've chosen the most respected non-Christian writers, as it's their hostile position to Jesus that actually provides particularly compelling evidence and will just help us begin to build a picture. So number 1, let's look at Bar Serapion. Bar Serapion was a Syrian philosopher who wrote a letter to his son around 73 AD discussing the execution of a Jewish king. He writes, "What benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras? Or the Jews by murdering their wise king? The wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted." And whilst this doesn't tell us much or even mention Jesus by name, here we do learn that in the 1st century there was a murdered Jewish king who lived on by his teaching. Number 2, there's Josephus. Now, Josephus was a professional Roman Jewish historian who references Jesus in his famous work, The Antiquities of the Jews, in 93 AD. Now, one text talks about Jesus performing surprising deeds and coming back from the dead. And whilst historians agree that this text was originally about Jesus, many believe that it may have been adjusted and isn't fully reliable. But in a later, unanimously reliable text, Josephus records, "Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." Now, if we discount that first controversial text, we still learn that Jesus was called the Christ and had a brother called James. Number 3, Celsus. Now, Celsus was a Greek philosopher and an early opponent of Christianity. His work, The True Word, survives in quotations here in Against Celsus by Origen of Alexandria. And he writes, "Jesus had come from a village in Judea and was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god." Now here we learn that Jesus was son of a village carpenter with a scandalous birth story. He became a refugee in Egypt, and he possessed magical powers and called himself God. Number 4, Tacitus. Now, Cornelius Tacitus is one of the most famous and trusted ancient historians. He's known for his careful analysis of historic documents and responsible for much of what we know about ancient Rome. And in this, the Annals of Imperial Rome, he writes, "Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians, as they were popularly called. Their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. But in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly superstition had broken out afresh not only in Judea, where the mischief had started, but even in Rome. Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. Then, on their information, large numbers of others were condemned. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animals' skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs, or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutes for daylight. Nero provided his gardens for the spectacle." Now, this one really is astonishing. Usually when a tyrannical regime tries to silence something, that's worth checking out. And here we learn that Christ was executed under Tiberius Caesar and Pontius Pilate. Number 5, Phlegon. Now, Phlegon was a Greek writer whose work partially survives through other historians, again Origen and Africanus. Interestingly, Phlegon documents both the eclipse and the earthquakes that mysteriously took place at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Origen writes, "With regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Phlegon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles." Now, Africanus confirms this, writing, Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour. Africanus also quotes Thales, who was an early historian who wrote in the 50s AD, saying, in the third book of his history, Thales calls this darkness a solar eclipse. But an eclipse of the sun cannot happen at any other time but in the interval between the first day of the new moon and the last of the old. So how is an eclipse supposed to happen when the moon is almost diametrically opposite the sun? And what we see here is several early historians wrestling with this impossible midday darkness that the gospel tells us occurred at Jesus' crucifixion. And here we learn a mysterious eclipse and earthquake occurred around the time of his crucifixion. Number 6, Pliny the Younger. Now, Pliny the Younger was a Roman senator and he was friends with the emperor. And amazingly, we have letters that he exchanged with the emperor, where in this book he talks about trying to stamp out early Christianity. He writes this, "This is the line I have taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. There have been others similarly fanatical who are Roman citizens. The sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately amongst themselves in honour of Christ as if to a god. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women. A great many individuals of every age and class, both men and women, are being brought to trial, and this is likely to continue. It is not only the towns, but villages and rural districts too. I think, though, that it is still possible for it to be checked and directed to better ends." When countless men and women, Roman and Greek, slave and free, are willing to be tortured and killed to pass on the truth of the resurrection, that should surely grab our attention. Here we learn that Christians of every demographic were meeting to sing to Christ as God, and many Christians were willingly tortured and killed for Christ and to pass on the truth of the resurrection. Number 7, Suetonius. Now, Suetonius was another 1st century Roman historian who records in this book the exile of the Jews from Rome. He wrote, "Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from the city." Now, we see this exact event in the Bible in Acts 18, and here we learn that the Jews were kicked out of Rome precisely because of Christ. Number 8, there's Lucian. Lucian of Samosata is an ancient Greek satirist, and he absolutely hated the Christians, which actually makes him pretty good source material. He wrote, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains their contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property." Here we learn Christians worshipped the crucified man, yet were fearless of death. They considered themselves family and shared everything they had. Now look, even by piecing together these 8 early accounts that are outside the Bible from Jesus' opponents, we still actually have a pretty comprehensive picture of what happened. And there are many more historic documents. There are, of course, the eyewitness accounts we have in the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, and the others. You can read all their letters in here. There are early Christian writings written by people like Polycarp, Clement, Ignatius, Barnabas, Justin Martyr. You can read about them here in the Penguin book, Early Christian Writings. And there are lots of slightly later writers that discuss the history of the church in the first 100 years. People like Augustine, Eusebius. You can read about them in this book. But just to put that in some context, very few records actually survive from 2,000 years ago. Tiberius Caesar is one of the most famous ancient figures, and yet in the first 150 years after his death, I'm told we have around 40 to 45 documents that mention him, but historians consider that very strong evidence. Remarkably, we currently have 42 unique early surviving texts about Jesus. That's the same as the Emperor of Rome. And so even atheist scholar Bart Ehrman concludes, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. Every sane historian on the planet concludes that Jesus was historical on the basis of compelling historical evidence. Some scholars go one step further. The old Lord Chief of Justice Charles Darling wrote, there exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true. And Thomas Arnold, an old professor of history at Oxford University, world famous for his 3-volume history of Rome, wrote this: no one fact in the history of mankind is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort than the fact that Christ died and rose from the dead. When I personally discovered that Jesus was a real guy, it actually blew my mind. The historicity of Jesus was what compelled me to look further into this man who claimed to be God, who others claimed did miracles and rose from the dead, who went on to change the world with his offer of truth and life. Now, this video isn't seeking to persuade you to follow Jesus, but simply to show that we can't write him off as fiction. The Jesus of faith is also the Jesus of history. And so perhaps the more interesting question is, who do you say he is? I really hope this video has been helpful. Check out the other videos on my channel. Have a great day.